In early 2025, the United States reignited trade tensions with China by imposing a new wave of tariffs. These tariffs, reaching up to 145%, targeted a wide range of Chinese imports. Key sectors like electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries, steel, and semiconductors were all affected. The stated goal of these tariffs was twofold. First, the U.S. aimed to address concerns about overcapacity in Chinese industries. Second, the tariffs were intended to protect American jobs and industries from what the U.S. government perceived as unfair competition. This move marked a significant escalation in the ongoing trade dispute between the world's two largest economies. The decision to impose tariffs stemmed from a complex web of economic and political factors. The U.S. government, under pressure from domestic industries, argued that China's trade practices were harming American businesses and workers. They pointed to issues such as intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and state subsidies that gave Chinese companies an unfair advantage. Additionally, the U.S. expressed concerns about China's growing technological prowess, particularly in strategic sectors like artificial intelligence and 5G. The tariffs, therefore, were seen as a tool to pressure China into changing its trade practices and to protect American economic interests. The impact of these tariffs was swift and far-reaching. Chinese exporters, heavily reliant on the American market, found themselves facing a significant barrier to trade. The tariffs made Chinese goods more expensive for American consumers, reducing demand and forcing many Chinese factories to scale back production or shut down entirely. This in turn led to widespread job losses, particularly in export-oriented sectors. The tariffs sent shockwaves through the Chinese economy, exposing its vulnerability to external shocks and raising questions about its long-term growth trajectory. The imposition of tariffs marked a turning point in the U.S.-China trade relationship. It signaled a shift away from dialogue and cooperation towards a more confrontational approach. The tariffs had the immediate effect of disrupting global supply chains and increasing costs for businesses and consumers on both sides of the Pacific. Moreover, they created an atmosphere of uncertainty and mistrust, making it more difficult for the two countries to address other pressing global challenges, such as climate change and nuclear proliferation. The re-escalation of the trade war had profound implications for the global economy and the future of the U.S.-China relationship. The impact of the U.S. tariffs on Chinese factories was immediate and devastating. Factories across China, particularly those in export-dependent provinces like Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Hunan, experienced a sharp decline in orders from the United States. This sudden drop in demand forced many factories to make difficult decisions. Some were forced to shut down entirely, unable to stay afloat amidst the shrinking market. Others resorted to drastic measures such as layoffs and wage cuts to reduce costs and weather the storm. The tariffs had a ripple effect throughout the Chinese manufacturing sector. As factories struggled to cope with the decline in orders, they began to delay payments to suppliers and contractors. This, in turn, created a domino effect, putting further strain on businesses up and down the supply chain. Small and medium-sized enterprises, which often lacked the financial reserves of larger companies, were hit particularly hard. Many were forced to close their doors, leading to further job losses and economic hardship. The impact of the tariffs was not limited to the factory floor. Workers, many of whom had migrated from rural areas in search of better opportunities, found themselves facing an increasingly precarious situation. Layoffs and wage cuts meant that many struggled to make ends meet. Sending money home to support their families became increasingly difficult. The sudden loss of income and uncertainty about the future created a climate of anxiety and fear among Chinese workers. The tariffs exposed the vulnerabilities of China's export-oriented growth model. For decades, China had relied heavily on exports, particularly to the United States, to fuel its economic growth. However, the tariffs highlighted the risks of such dependence on a single market. The Chinese government was now faced with the challenge of finding new markets for its goods and diversifying its economy away from exports. The tariffs served as a wake-up call, forcing China to rethink its economic strategy and chart a new course for the future. The Hunan protests, which erupted in April 2025, provided a stark illustration of the human cost of the U.S.-China trade war. Over 300 workers at a sporting goods factory in Hunan province took to the streets to protest unpaid wages and compensation following the factory's sudden closure. The factory, heavily reliant on exports to the United States, had been forced to shut down due to a sharp decline in orders following the imposition of U.S. tariffs. The workers, many of whom had not been paid for months, were left in a desperate situation. They had families to support, rent to pay, and mouths to feed. The factory closure and the lack of compensation had plunged them into financial ruin. The protests in Hunan were not an isolated incident. Similar protests erupted in other parts of China as workers, feeling the pinch of the trade war, demanded their unpaid wages and expressed their anger at the government's handling of the situation. The Hunan protests, despite facing censorship and government attempts to downplay their significance, quickly gained national attention. Videos and images of the protests spread rapidly on social media platforms like Weibo and Douyin, capturing the desperation and anger of the workers. The protests struck a chord with many Chinese citizens who were also feeling the economic strain of the trade war. The Chinese government responded to the protests with a mix of repression and concession. On the one hand, authorities moved swiftly to quell the unrest, deploying police to disperse protesters and detain organizers. Censorship was also ramped up, with social media platforms ordered to remove any content related to the protests. On the other hand, the government also announced measures to provide financial assistance to affected workers and businesses. These measures included short-term subsidies to factories struggling to stay afloat and unemployment benefits for laid-off workers. Section 4. A Generation Adrift, China's Mounting Youth Unemployment Crisis. The U.S. tariffs exacerbated an already concerning trend in China rising youth unemployment. By early 2025, the unemployment rate for young people aged 16 to 24 had surged past 21%, a record high. This alarming figure reflected the growing challenges facing China's younger generation in finding stable and well-paying jobs. The tariffs, which primarily impacted export-oriented sectors that traditionally employed a significant number of young workers, added fuel to the fire. The rise in youth unemployment was driven by a confluence of factors. One key factor was the slowdown in China's economic growth. As the Chinese economy matured, it transitioned from a phase of rapid export-driven growth to a more moderate and sustainable pace of development. This transition, however, resulted in fewer job opportunities, particularly in manufacturing, which had been a major employer for young workers. The mismatch between the skills possessed by young job seekers and the needs of the evolving job market further compounded the problem. China's education system, with its emphasis on rote learning and memorization, often failed to equip graduates with the practical skills and critical thinking abilities demanded by employers in sectors like technology, finance, and services. As the formal job market contracted, many young people were forced to turn to the informal sector for employment. Informal jobs, often characterized by low pay, lack of benefits, and job insecurity, proliferated in sectors such as delivery services, online retail, and food vending. While these jobs provided a temporary lifeline for some, they did little to address the underlying structural issues in the labor market. Section 5. Beijing's Balancing Act, Economic Stimulus and Social Control. Faced with mounting economic pressure and growing social unrest, the Chinese government responded with a two-pronged approach. On the economic front, authorities implemented a series of measures aimed at stimulating growth and mitigating the impact of the trade war. On the social front, the government moved decisively to tighten its grip on information and suppress any signs of dissent. To cushion the economic blow, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, cut interest rates and reduced reserve requirements for banks. These measures were intended to encourage lending, boost investment, and inject liquidity into the struggling economy. Additionally, provincial governments across China rolled out short-term subsidies to help factories stay afloat and retain workers. These subsidies, however, were often insufficient to offset the losses incurred due to the tariffs and did little to address the underlying structural issues in the economy. Recognizing the need to address the long-term challenges posed by the trade war, the Chinese government accelerated its dual circulation strategy. This strategy, first unveiled in 2020, aimed to reduce China's reliance on exports and foreign technology by boosting domestic consumption and fostering technological self-reliance. The government hoped that by rebalancing the economy towards domestic demand, China would be less vulnerable to external shocks like the U.S. tariffs. While the government attempted to address the economic fallout of the trade war, it simultaneously moved to tighten its grip on information and suppress any signs of social unrest. Censorship was ramped up, with social media platforms ordered to scrub any content deemed critical of the government's handling of the trade war or sympathetic to the plight of workers affected by the tariffs. Surveillance of worker activity, both online and offline, was intensified, and labor rights NGOs faced increased scrutiny and pressure from authorities.